Hello, and welcome to God and Riding. Today I'm going to be going over the process of changing the rear tire on a KLR650, but the general process is applicable to most motorcycles. I'll go over the steps and some tips along the way. The first thing you need to do is remove the rear tire, and that involves getting it off the ground. Majority of the time I just use a piece of wood and prop it up under the swing arm so it's resting on the kickstand. Today I'm using a jack, but the idea is the same. So all I've done up to this point is to remove the cotter pin from the axle. It goes through the castle nut and the axle to keep the nut from backing out on its own. And now I'm just removing the castle nut from the axle. Whenever you're doing this, always make sure you're keeping track of all your pieces, nuts, washers. There are also spacers in between the wheel and the swing arms that protect the bearings in the hub that tend to stick but fall out when you least expect it. So now that I have the axle nut off, it's time to remove the axle. You'll see me put my foot under the tire at a few stages of this. I like to use that to raise it up and wiggle the tire up and down, as you can see there. It's key right here to move the tire forward a little bit to get some slack on the chain so you can remove it. Just drop it down, then just slowly roll it back. You want to make sure that your brake caliper is not catching on your rotor and nothing else is hung up. The brake calipers sit in a little slotted track on the swing arm, on a KLR at least. You can leave it there. I like to slide it out and just set it on top of the swing arm to make sure it doesn't slip out and fall and put too much pressure on the brake lines. And then most of the time I like to just put the axle back in with the nuts and washers so I don't lose anything or forget a component when it comes time to reinstall the tire. On the bike currently are Motaz Tractionator Adventure tires. I'm going to be replacing those with the new set of Shinko 705s. The Shinkos are a lot less aggressive new, but I'm going to be taking a 1,000 or so mile trip later this month, and the cow slayer needed some new shoes. This is a bolt I like to use when changing my tires. It passes through the center of the wheel and into a slot in the table that I made. It allows me to rotate the tire and keeps it a little more stable. With the bolt I use a washer, then a black plastic washer that I made that goes against the wheel so it doesn't damage it. From time to time I do practice changing it on the ground so I am able to on the trail. The tools I'll be using today, I always keep with me on the bike. I have a valve core extraction tool. I keep 2 tusk tire levers and a larger curved lever, mainly for breaking the bead. You'll see me use that a little bit later on. And a 12mm crescent wrench for removing the nut on the valve stem. If your tires have been on for a long time, that nut can get a little crusty on there, so I always keep some pliers with me to hold the valve stem steady while I break it loose. At this point we need to break the bead, which is separating the wheel and the tire at the mating point. Sometimes you can just do it by pressing down like I am right here. Other times you need to get tools involved. On the trail you can use a kickstand of another bike or your own center stand if you have one. Otherwise you have to get a little more creative. Working at home or in a shop, I've found a large clamp and that curved tire iron seem to be the best way to go. You want to get the clamp as close as possible to the rim without actually pressing on it. And then I get that curved tire iron in there and get a little more leverage and break it loose. Then just make your way around the tire to break it loose. This one, once I got it started, it was easy enough just to push it down on this side. And I'll just flip it over and do the same thing on the other side. Lubrication is key for making this process as easy as possible. Here I'm using a mixture of just dish soap and water. Talcum powder actually works really well too. I keep a small bottle with me on my bike to use on the trail. You just start with the tire spoons, get an edge, and pry up and over. The removal process is usually pretty straightforward, fairly easy. The hard part comes when we go to install the new tire. You want to pull the tire as high up on the rim as you can to make it easier to get the spoon down in there to catch the other edge. Usually once you get two of them in there and popped up, you can just pull the tire off the rest of the way. Which is where having the bolt going down through the table to hold the tire in place really comes in handy. On the valve stem of the tube, you're going to have a valve stem cap and two nuts. You want to remove the valve stem cap and the first nut, and then tighten the second one down, hand tight, to the tube. If your tires are directional, they're most likely going to have an arrow pointing which way it needs to rotate. With this particular tire, it can go on a front or rear, so it has separate arrows for front or rear placement. If you get it wrong, it's not make or break, but you're going to be leaving performance on the table, and I suggest you let that one marinate. So just like removing, you're really going to want to make sure you lube up the bead of this tire. I'll be doing this a few times during the process. We'll start this out by dropping the first edge into the wheel and then pulling it into the center as far as possible. The first lip of this tire is definitely the easiest part of the installation process. There are a few ways you can get the tube into the tire. The way I prefer is slightly inflating it and installing it at this point. None of the ways are super easy, but that's just kind of what you have to deal with when you're using tube tires. The biggest pain is getting the valve stem through the hole in the wheel. Just not a whole lot of room to work with. I usually wedge about half of it in there before I put the valve stem through. Try to keep it lined up as much as possible. And at this point I've realized I put a little bit too much air in, so I'm gonna take a little bit out. They do make little tools. It's a wire that threads into your valve stem core that makes threading it through the hole a little easier, but I don't have one. But at this point you just gotta wedge your hand in there, push it through, and once you get a little bit out, thread that first nut back on as much as you can. It'll only go on a little bit, but it's enough to keep it from going back into the wheel. And just wedge the rest of the tube back in. I always go around after to make sure it's pushed down as far as possible and not kinked up. The biggest risk with installing tubes is getting a pinch flat, which is pinching the tube with your tire spoon while you're installing the tire, and it gives a pinhole leak. So try to keep the tube as far out of the way as possible and just watch the end of your tire spoons during this portion. Which is also the reason for slightly inflating the tube before we install it. It helps keep it in place and keep it from folding over. Here's where the fun begins. So just like installing the first side, start with a couple tire levers, start working your way around. This portion is where a tool called a bead buddy really comes in handy. I have one and I actually keep it on my bike, but I'm not using it this time for demonstration purposes. You can see on the right hand side there, as I'm going around through this section, the tire is actually coming out of the wheel, which is where the bead buddy would be useful. Once you get about 2/3 of the way around, it's really key to keep pushing in on the closest section to you to make sure that your tire isn't getting set on the bead and that it's down more in the center of the wheel. If you don't do that, this last section will not go on. So here I'm taking that large tire spoon and kind of using it as a bead buddy. I'm getting it down as far as possible into the wheel without pinching the tube, so the tire doesn't pop off on that side. You got to make sure you keep a hand on it or it'll flip down and hit you in the arm. Not that I know from experience. It's key here just to kind of go a little bit at a time. What I did here was actually an accident, but it worked out pretty well using the 2 spoons at one time. And then once you get that last lip over the edge, really just push down and it'll pop in place. I got lucky, my camera actually died right there. I'm real happy it didn't happen a couple seconds sooner. So now the hard part's over. Just tighten down that nut on your valve stem by hand a little bit and air it up. You'll hear a couple pops here in a second. And that was the tire seating on the bead. I always give it a little extra, and then I look at a spot on the tire. Usually there's a little bit of a lip over the rim, and spin it around to make sure it's evenly seated all the way around. If it's not, sometimes just adding a little more air will do it. Other times you need to add a lot more air, bounce it on some concrete, sometimes taking air out and then reseating it will do it. Some tires are just real easy to seat and some are a real pain. This one seated real nice, so I didn't have a problem. Now I'll just take the extra air out, verify it's at the PSI I want it, and then we'll go back and reinstall. And since I put the axle back through and put all the hardware back in place, everything's right where I left it and nothing got lost. Slide the brake calipers back in place, pull it back out a little bit just to the edge so I can get the wheel in and the caliper won't be in the way. And you want to verify both your wheel spaces are in place. They space out the wheel and they ride on the bearings inside your axle. So if you don't have those in, you're going to have a bad day. Just take your time here, line everything up, make sure your calipers are going around your brake rotor. And as you can see here, I'm using my foot again as leverage to get everything in place, so I still have my hands free to do adjustments. You want to slide your wheel forward a little bit far so you can get your chain back on, and then you're ready to slide your axle through. At this point, you can go ahead and install your washer and your castle nut. And make sure your wheel is seated firmly against your chain tensioners. Or if you need to adjust your chain, now's the time to do it before you tighten up your axle nut. On the castle nut, there are grooves you'll want to line up with the hole in your axle so you can get your cotter pin back through. I'll just install my cotter pin, bend it back so it doesn't fall out, and we're good to go. Oh, thank you for going on this journey with me. I hope you learned something. Please like, share, subscribe, tell your friends, scream it from a mountain, and have a great day.